Hey guys, I'm Naguura and today I'm going to be talking about how to play Moonkin in Mythic Plus. First of all, I want to say that there's no perfect guide on how to play Mythic Plus because it heavily depends on the level of the key, what affixes, what kind of comp you're playing, and also what route you're playing. Of course, if your tank keeps pulling 10 mobs, 10 mobs, 10 mobs, then you're going to be doing a lot more overall DPS and you're going to play a little bit different compared to a person that only pulls 2 mobs at a time or 3, right? So it's definitely very heavily dependent on that. But I can give you some general tips and some pointers on what the most optimal way of doing max DPS will be in some different situations, and I hope that helps you out. Right, so first I'm gonna go over some like general things like gear, talents, and so on. I'm gonna do this very quickly because Mythic Plus is not like a perfectly calculated science or something that we can perfectly theory craft. All of this is more of like my opinion that I think is best, but that doesn't mean that you can change things around a little and do something slightly different, all right? So let's go into gear first. When it comes to gear, I personally recommend that you're just simming your character. I just want to get this myth out of the way that there's some sort of caps that you need to reach or a certain amount of mastery, certain amount of haste. No, you don't need any sort of caps. You don't need to reach any certain amount of anything, right? You just need to sim your character, see what sims best for you, and that's it. I know a lot of people don't know how to sim and plus properly, and again, it's not like a perfect science, but you can sim single target and then you can sim patchwork 5 targets on like a lower duration depending on what kind of key levels you are running, and then you compare the two and just pick whatever is best for both situations. If you don't know how to sim properly, I will link a video in the description below that explains raid bots and how to sim and plus somehow and how to get like the best results in that regard. After the stats and after your normal gear, let's talk about trinkets real quick. Double unused trinket, so Imperial Ordnance plus Inscrutable Quantum Device or Instructor's Divine Bell is a really good trinket combination for raiding, but for M+, not so much. I do not recommend running 2 unused trinkets in M+, unless it's like a very specific situation. For example, in Mists of Terna Scythe, Moonkins like running double unused if it means that they're going to be skipping one phase of the first boss of Ingra. So if you want to use it for that reason, sure, because then you're going to be saving quite a lot of time. Otherwise, I do not recommend running that trinket unless you're like really specifically doing something that will save you a lot of time, like having more burst damage on Hakar, having more burst damage on Ingra, and so on. Then for legendaries, the best legendary is Balance of All Things in M+. If you're playing Night Fae, which is the best covenant in M+, so you should be playing that. There's other legendaries that can work. You can run Circle, you can run Pulsar, but they're incredibly situational and they're definitely not overall better. I would say Bolt is the legendary that is just your go-to because it emphasizes our strength as a moonkin. It just makes our convoke even better, it makes our burst even better, and that is really what we are good at. Our single target burst, our fewer targets burst. We can also do a lot of AoE, right? Which Balance of All Things is not that great for compared to the other legendaries, but losing out on that extra single target burst and that extra damage that we have with our convoke is definitely just hurting us a lot. Definitely recommend running both. But if you want to play around with other legendaries, you're more than free to do that, and it's definitely not going to be incredibly bad, right? Running Pulsar or running Circle or whatever is going to be totally fine, especially in lower keys when things die a bit quicker, I guess. It would be nice to have more CA uptime on Pulsar and so on. So try around a little if you don't want to run both, and you should totally be fine with that too. I think that was all about gear that I wanted to mention. The best trinket combination would be, in my opinion, running either Inscrutable Quantum Device or Instructor's Divine Bell, one of those 2 trinkets, because they're so good with Convoke and with our cooldowns. So one of those 2 unused trinkets, I definitely recommend playing. Which one? They're both good. It depends on the item level a little, because your Divine Bell can only go up to 203 item level, while Quantum Device goes to 226. Pick whatever you like more. Quantum Device lasts a bit longer, the buff, but has a longer cooldown, so you cannot get a usage in between your cooldowns. But then a lot of people, myself included, play Divine Bell and then they forget to use it at 150, which makes it you know, like you just lost the usage, right? So I definitely think you should just play whatever you feel like. Both are really good. So whatever works for you. And when it comes to the other trinket, the other second slot would be a not unused trinket. So you would be using something like the Kabbalist trinket from Denathrius, or Unbound Changeling if you want to. You can also run the PvP trinket, the non-unused one. And yeah, one of those trinkets is totally going to be fine, or whatever else you have, just sim your character, see what's best for you. So let's move on to the talent combination. I recommend running Force of Nature, Soul of the Forest, Stellar Drift, and Solstice. Soul of the Forest, Stellar Drift, and Solstice is pretty straightforward. Everyone's running that, but some people actually prefer running Nature's Balance over Force of Nature. And I constantly have a debate about this on my stream because people think Nature's Balance is so much better and they don't need the trees necessarily, and therefore they are running Nature's Balance. And I just want to make it clear that the difference in damage between Nature's Balance and Force of Nature is incredibly small, and it's not as big as people think it is, because they're both just astral power generators, okay? Both of those talents generate astral power. Force of Nature gives you 20 astral power every 1 minute, and Nature's Balance gives you more consistent astral power over combat time, right? Nature's Balance is slightly better when you have that more consistent astral power generation, arguably. But the thing is, a lot of people think that the 50 astral power that happens with Nature's Balance, with the rebalancing of your astral power, so when you have Nature's Balance, it will rebalance to 50 instead of 0 when you're out of combat. The thing is though, this does not happen in M+. Yeah, in M+, you're not out of combat long enough for this rebalancing to happen. So if you have Nature's Balance and you deplete your astral power to 0 at the end of a pack, you're not gonna have 50 when you pull the next pack. That's just not gonna happen unless your tank goes AFK for like a minute in between pulls. And that's not how you want to play in M+, right? So it's very, very rare that you would deplete all of your astral power to 0 if you don't have Nature's Balance. And it's also incredibly rare that your astral power would rebalance to 50 from 0 if you run Nature's Balance. So just imagine that part of Nature's Balance does not exist for M+, because it's useless. The only reason why Nature's Balance is slightly better is because of the astral power generation that happens in combat every 2 seconds. Not because of the rebalancing, okay? But the thing is that Force of Nature is just so good, not just because of the astral power generation, but also because it taunts everything within the radius, which makes the tank not die, makes him reset necrotic, makes him be able to not having to kite, and so on. And the thing is, it also is like a passive damage increase for other people in your group, because the healer can do more damage while the trees are tanking, because the tank is not taking more damage. The tank can do more damage while the trees are tanking because he doesn't have to worry about dying. And you also prevent the kiting needing to happen, right? If your tank is out of cooldowns, you put your trees down, the tank does not have to run away or kite. You also don't have to interrupt the mobs when the trees are down, so that's also incredibly valuable. You can just say, hey, trees are tanking, you don't have to interrupt anymore. At least the casts that are going on their aggro target, right? Of course, you still have to interrupt other things that are like AoE damage in a group. But all that kind of stuff is just like passive damage increases that just speaks for Force of Nature. But of course, if your tank really doesn't want you to run trees, doesn't want you to taunt, doesn't want any of this, tree shenanigans to happen, then just play Nature's Balance, do what you feel like. But I personally definitely prefer trees, and I would run trees in any affix combination, any level of the key, and any dungeon as well. So up to you. This is just my opinion about it. Then we're moving on when it comes to Soulbinds. We always play Nia. Always, always. It's our best Soulbind by far. When it comes to Conduits and the way you build Nia, it's not actually that big of a deal on how you build Nia for M+. The only thing that is important is that you have one potency conduit, and that one should be Conflux. Everything else is really not that big of a deal. People constantly ask me, should I play Nia's Burst? Should I play a second potency slot? Which second potency conduit should I be running? And so on. Here's my opinion. I personally like running 2 potencies in M+. I like running Conflux and Fury of the Skies. The difference between like Fury of the Skies and Umbral Intensity and like the Celestial Alignment extension conduit it's all kind of small, like it's incredibly like a tiny difference, and it's really, really situational. Sometimes one is better, sometimes the other is better, sometimes even Nia's Burst is really good. So instead of running a second potency, you run Nia's Burst. It depends. You should just play whatever you feel like you like most. I can give you like the pros and cons for all of those conduits. In my opinion, Nia's Burst would be the best conduit if you want to like have the most single target damage, okay? So if you want to increase your boss damage, your pride damage, and so on, the Nia's Burst would be the best. But Nia's Burst definitely lacks on all the other fronts, right? Then, if you want to run a second potency conduit, then you can run Fury of the Skies. I personally like Fury of the Skies because I think it gives you damage for like almost all situations. The only time where it's not that strong is when you're doing like huge AoE pulls and you're Starfiring and you don't have Moonfires up, because then you don't get the extra arcane damage from your Moonfires, which is what Fury of the Skies does. But then in my opinion, I feel like if I'm not going to be applying Moonfire to those ads, then they're dying so quickly that I don't need that extra damage in that case. You know, like it might boost my overall damage, but it's going to be damage that is not going to make us do the dungeon much faster, right? Because it's just damage on like huge AoE where things dying pretty quickly anyway. If they would be alive for longer, then you have time to apply your Moonfire and then you get the arcane damage and Starfire anyway, right? So that's why I prefer Fury of the Skies. It's also good for 1 target, for 2 targets, 3 targets. It's just the most versatile conduit in my opinion that gives you like a decent damage increase for all situations. Now, Umbral Intensity is really good for Starfire Cleave on AoE, but not so good on anything else. So that would be like boosting your AoE damage, but not really boosting any other thing, which again can be played especially in dungeons like halls or maybe even for stuff like Arden Wield area and the other side. In those kind of dungeons, you can totally, you know, argue for it. But at the same time, I just feel like the one thing that saves you the most time is not always like the huge AoE pulls, but rather doing the prides a bit faster, doing the bosses a bit faster, doing like the smaller pulls a bit faster. I always think that is slightly more valuable to your dungeon speed than having slightly more AoE damage. But that's my opinion, and every moonkin kind of has their own little thing that they play. Again, the difference between all those conduits is incredibly small, and you can just pick whatever you want, as long as you have conflux. Alright, so done talking about stats and gear and all that stuff. Let's talk a little bit about the actual gameplay itself. First of all, before the key starts, make sure you prep your Astral Power and pre-use your Celestial Alignment. Preparing your Astral Power, what I mean by that is either put like a turnip down, which is a toy from Mist of Pandaria, or you can just pull some mobs in Mythic 0, pull your Astral Power while you kill them, and then once the mobs are dead, you get out of combat, and then you start the key. And then you already have 100 Astral Power when you start the key, which means that as soon as you do that first pull, you already have enough Astral Power to Starfall immediately. You know the struggle of starting a pull, there's like 10 mobs and you don't have any Astral Power and you're just dotting everything up and you're just like trying to get Astral Power to be able to Starfall, and once you have a Starfall up, the pack is already dead. Right? Like it's a huge damage loss to not have Starfall there on those big pulls at the start, so definitely make sure you're preparing Astral Power before you pull. And you can also use Celestial Alignment before the key starts, because your Celestial Alignment CD resets as soon as the key starts, but the uptime actually stays, the buff stays. So it's a 20 seconds buff, which means that you can get a little bit of uptime when the key starts. It's a minor thing and it's not gonna do anything if you don't immediately pull as the key starts. It's a small thing, but do it if it gives you any benefit, because it's for free. Then, let's go into actual gameplay once the key started. Let's talk about general rules first. These general rules are going to be the biggest damage gain. I'm going to talk about very, very detailed situations later on, but just keep in mind that those detailed situations are very heavily like min-maxy things. And doing those perfectly is not going to give you like that big of a damage increase. It's going to be like very tiny damage increases. The biggest things are the general rules that I'm talking about now. Number 1, keep Starfall up at all costs. Number 2, optimize your CD usage. And number 3, maximize your Eclipse uptime. Alright, let's go a little bit into more detail for these points. First of all, keep Starfall up at all costs. We all know that on 2 targets or more, you want to have Starfall up at all times. One thing that people don't always do perfectly is refresh your Starfall in pandemic range. Starfall is pandemic. That means if you refresh it on 3 seconds or below, then those 3 seconds or 2 seconds will be added to your full uptime on your new Starfall, okay? So you will not lose any uptime at all if you just refresh your Starfall there. You should do that so it never like completely drops. Then, another thing that people don't do with Starfall is making sure you have enough astral power for it. People know that they have to Starfall, but then people also don't think ahead enough. You definitely have to plan ahead, make sure you're pooling your astral power at the end of a pack, so you have enough astral power when you enter the next pack. As I said earlier, when I was talking about nature's balance and force of nature, the rebalancing of your astral power takes a long time. So if you leave a pack, like if you're killing a pack, and you get out of combat, and you have like 80 astral power, that 80 astral power will stay for a long time. It will not instantly deplete, okay? So you should definitely just go into the next pool with a decent amount of astral power ready, preferably more than 50, so you can immediately Starfall as you're pulling. That's going to be one of the biggest damage increases if you're not doing this already. If you're somebody who is always depleting your astral power completely as you're finishing off a pack, this tip of pooling your astral power is gonna give you the biggest damage increase for sure, okay? So make sure you do that. You can even do that on bosses as well, not just on trash packs. I always try to pool astral power at the end of a boss as well, to be able to have enough astral power as we enter the new trash pack that we fight right afterwards. Unless, of course, we are struggling on a boss and we are about to wipe. So yeah, make sure you pool the astral power as much as you can. All right, so when it comes to CDs, make sure you're not holding your CDs for too long. If you need to use your CDs on a boss, you don't need to have those CDs ready immediately, right? Some people think, oh, there's going to be like a super difficult boss coming up and I need my cooldowns for it, otherwise we wipe. Which might very well be true, and our cooldowns are really good on bosses, so it's definitely worth it to hold cooldowns or to use them on the boss. But a lot of people think it's incredibly important to have your cooldowns on pull of the boss, which is usually not correct. It doesn't matter when exactly you're using your cooldowns, as long as you use them on the boss. The only thing you have to consider is like the pride buff window. If you're playing with pride and you kill the pride before the boss, the pride buff lasts 1 minute. So you definitely want to make sure that you get your cooldowns into that 1 minute window onto the boss, because that's a pretty big damage increase. But everything else is not that big of a deal, all right? So just make sure that if the boss is coming up in 2 minutes, you can still use your cooldowns, because then you can just use your cooldowns on a boss just like a minute later, right? So that's all fine. Just think a little bit ahead and think approximately of how long it's going to take for you to reach that boss. Look at the percentage. See, is there going to be a pride in between the trash and the boss, because the pride takes a while to kill as well. Depending on your key level, takes more or less time to kill. So just try to get better at calculating or estimating how much time it's gonna be, so you're not like sitting on your cooldowns for too long. One more thing about cooldowns is hold your convoke for CA. A lot of people asking, but then I lose so many convokes, and is it really worth it? And the answer is, in my opinion, yes, it's worth it to always hold your convoke for your CA, because it's just such a big combination of cooldowns, and either of those cooldowns by itself are just not as strong. If you're using your CA without convoke, then you're missing out on the mastery buff from Nia, which is like a huge portion of damage on AoE, especially if you're, Starfiring in Celestial Alignment. If you don't have that convoke buff, the Nia buff, the mastery buff, that's a pretty big damage loss. And the same goes for convoking outside of CA. If you convoke without CA, then you're missing the 40% crits on your astral spells, because you're only in 1 Eclipse and not in 2. So at that point, you're just missing 40% damage on your Starfall and 40% damage on your Starsurges. 40% crit, sorry, not damage, which is also a pretty big damage loss. And you're also missing damage as well from the mastery, right, from your Eclipse. So you miss 40% crit and the half of your Eclipse bonus on your astral spells. So it's definitely, in my opinion, not good to divide those cooldowns unless you can get a free convoke. And what I mean by a free convoke is, for example, like you're gonna be coming up to a pool where you need your cooldowns. And this pool is gonna be approximately in 2 minutes. So in that case, if your cooldowns are ready, if your convoke is ready and your celestial alignment is ready, you cannot use your CA, right? Because in 2 minutes you need to use it and it's a 3-minute cooldown. So you have to hold it. But your convoke is a 2-minute cooldown. So you can use your convoke on that pool and then you will get it back up for when you want to use CA plus convoke on that specific pool. That's what I consider a free convoke, and that's when obviously you should be using it because it's literally for free. If you're convoking outside of CA, then always convoke in Solar Eclipse if you can choose, unless it's going to take too long, of course, because sometimes cycling eclipses back and forth takes a while. So if your convoke is ready and you need to use it now, and you're about to enter Lunar Eclipse, then do it. But if you can choose and if you can prepare it properly, you should always convoke in Solar Eclipse, because convoke casts Wraths, but not Starfire. And of course, Wrath is empowered by Solar Eclipse, and therefore it's worth it, even on like huge AoE pulls, like even on 8 targets or something, it's worth it to convoke in Solo over Lunar. Then let's talk about quickly on how to prepare your CA plus convoke. When you're about to use your cooldowns on an AoE pack, definitely make sure you Sunfire first. And when it comes to moonfiring before your convoke, it's actually a damage gain to moonfire up to 10 targets, but only if that trash pack survives your full celestial alignment and you can still enter your lunar eclipse afterwards and it survives like half of your lunar eclipse, which would be approximately almost up to 50 seconds, depending on how many targets there are. So if a trash group does not last 50 seconds, which it rarely does, right? 50 seconds is a long time, especially if you're going to be using cooldowns. Then it's probably not worth to apply moonfires unless there's only a few targets and it's only a few globals, right? Of course, when it's 1 target, you always want to apply moonfire. If it's 2, 3, 4 targets, you can always argue, let's just apply some moonfires, especially when the tank is gathering the pool. That is something I see people do wrong as well. When the tank is going in, pulling something, and you're about to use your cooldowns, don't Sunfire, 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 and then you use your cooldowns. Just moonfire as he's gathering up the pool, because your Sunfire is not going to be cleaving on everything. You do not want to waste globals on Sunfiring multiple times. You only want to Sunfire once. So while they're spread out, just moonfire a couple of adds. Once they're stacked, you Sunfire, and then you can use your cooldowns, right? Only moonfire the adds if they're going to be living your full CA, or if there's like very few adds. On big pulls, I also prefer to use Starfall before I convoke, if I have the astral power for it. So if you're starting a pool and I have enough astral power and I'm about to use my cooldowns, I will use Starfall before. And the reason why is because convoke almost always casts Starfall, but if your convoke is moonfiring a lot, so if there's a lot of adds that do not have moonfire on them, then chances are it might just skip the Starfall. And then that's quite a big damage loss, right? Because then you just used your cooldowns, you have all of this mastery, you have all of this crit, and your Starfall is not up. So you're losing quite a lot of damage. You can Starfall after your convoke then, because you're probably going to have enough astral power, but it's still like a decent damage loss, and that's why I like to just use it beforehand. And one more thing as well is that even if your convoke casts Starfall, it could be at the very end, right? It could be casting Starfall at like the last second of your convoke, and then you also just lost like 3 seconds or something of Starfall uptime. So that's why I prefer using it before. But don't force it. Like, definitely don't try to get enough astral power to Starfall if you're going to be using cooldowns anyway. Then let's talk about maximizing your Eclipse uptime. When it comes to Eclipse, a lot of people don't necessarily understand what they should be doing inside Eclipse and outside Eclipse. And the answer is, I'm going to go into much more detail later. But as a general idea, make sure you just optimize your Eclipse uptime as much as you can. And the reason why is because when you're inside an Eclipse, everything you do, just more damage, okay? Because your Solar Eclipse gives you more nature damage, your Lunar Eclipse gives you more arcane damage. And our biggest damage in Plus is Starfall, which is astral damage. And astral damage means it's lunar plus solar. So that means that Starfall does more damage in either eclipses. You do more Starfall damage in Solar, and you do more Starfall damage in Lunar. So if you're idling outside of your Eclipse, you're losing uptime on your buff. Just imagine that your Eclipses are like tiny potions, as if it's like a damage potion. And the more time you spend outside of Eclipse, the less uptime you have on this buff, on this potion, right? So you should definitely always cycle in, especially also because we are running both, Balance of All Things. Whenever you enter Eclipse, you get the crit buff. So the more often you enter an Eclipse, the more often you get this crit buff, and all of your damage abilities do more damage because of the crit, right? So it's definitely more valuable to keep cycling into Eclipses than to just, idle outside, because your Eclipse time is not as valuable as it seems. Like, you don't have to try to maximize your inside Eclipse damage by wrathing or whatever, when you can just maximize your overall Eclipse uptime. Then let's talk about more specific and in-depth openers. I know a lot of people ask me these questions all the time. I'm going to give you like the exact details on when to apply Moonfire, when to cast Starfire, and so on. So let's just go over this, and I hope this really helps you out if you don't know what exactly to do. So let's talk about our AoE opener. So if you're about to pull a trash pack, and you are about to enter Solar Eclipse, okay, so you cannot choose, you can only enter Solar Eclipse. What do you do then? Well, first you apply Sunfire. If the adds are stacked, so it cleaves with one global. If they're not, then Starfall, if you have enough Astral Power, which you should have. If not, then enter Solar Eclipse, because while entering Solar Eclipse, you will generate Astral Power, okay? These steps that I just mentioned, Sunfire and Starfall, immediately apply Sunfire and immediately apply Starfall as soon as you can. Otherwise, we're moving on. Enter Solar Eclipse. Then we apply Moonfires in Solar Eclipse up until 10 targets if the adds survive until your next Lunar Eclipse. So if the adds don't instantly die, if they're going to be surviving until you enter your next Lunar Eclipse, you will apply Moonfire, okay, up to 10 targets. But if the adds don't survive until your next Lunar Eclipse, which is a short time, yeah? So if the adds die within 5 to 10 seconds as you enter your Solar Eclipse, then you cast Wrath between 1 and 4 targets, and you cast Starfire on 5 or more targets, +1 for each 20% mastery you have. So if you have 25% mastery, for example, then that would be +1. So that means you would cast Wrath until 5 targets, and then Starfire if there's 6 or more. If you have 45% mastery, you will be casting Wrath until 6 targets, and then Starfire if there's 7 or more. And the reason why that is because your mastery gives you more Eclipse bonus damage, and if you're in Solar Eclipse, your Starfire does not get the bonus damage, but your Wrath does. So the more mastery you have, the less worth it is to cast a spell that is not benefiting from your mastery. Then, Starsurge, if you have excess Astral Power, but try to use your boat window if you can. If you already have a fresh Starfall up and you're about to enter Solar Eclipse and you have like 50, 60 Astral Power with a full stack Starfall, then definitely Starsurge as you enter. But think about like the future. If you're going to be moonfiring in your whole Solar Eclipse, you're not going to be generating a lot of Astral Power doing that, right? If you're not wrathing in Solar Eclipse or not Starfiring or whatever, then you're not generating that much Astral Power. So definitely make sure that don't Starsurge if that means that you're going to be losing Starfall uptime later on, okay? And I want to mention one more thing about this Wrath versus Starfire. A lot of people constantly ask me, how many targets do there have to be for me to Starfire in Lunar Eclipse? When do I Starfire? When do I Starfire? And the answer is, you almost never Starfire in Solar Eclipse. That's actually like not a situation that happens very often, because you almost always prefer moonfiring in Solar Eclipse, okay? Always try to moonfire first, and Starfiring should only be a thing like if the adds are really just about to die and there's more than however many targets you need with the amount of mastery you have, okay? Definitely don't focus on because it really doesn't do a lot of damage because it's not buffed by your mastery. That Starfire in Solar Eclipse, it also doesn't get affected by your boat buff, by the way. That's something that some people didn't know either. Your Balance of All Things gives you a nature crit. when you enter solar eclipse. And your Starfire doesn't do nature damage. So your boat does not affect that Starfire that you're casting, and it also is not affected by the solar eclipse either. So it's definitely pretty weak to Starfire in that eclipse. One more thing to note here is that Astral Power generation. If you're trying to get Starfall up as fast as you can, then Wrath is just better to cast, even if there's like a lot of targets, because your Wrath gives you more Astral Power generation per time spent than your Starfire does. So definitely make sure that you're focusing on those things first before you start Starfiring in solar eclipse. Right, next AoE opener situation. So you're about to pull a pack and you're about to enter lunar eclipse. You can't choose between lunar or solar or whatever, you can only enter lunar. So in this scenario, you do apply Standfire first, again, if the ads are stacked, otherwise don't wait until they're stacked and apply it later. Then Starfall, if you have enough Astral Power. If you don't have enough Astral Power, try to get as much Astral Power as you can immediately and apply Starfall immediately. Then, if there are 5 or less ads and they will live through your lunar eclipse, then apply Moonfires before you enter eclipse, okay? So if you're pulling a pack, you're about to enter lunar eclipse, and there's 2 ads or 3 ads or 4 or 5, so up to 5, you actually apply your Moonfires before you enter lunar eclipse, but only if they will actually live your whole lunar eclipse, okay? So if you keep in mind, applying Moonfire also takes time, especially if there's 5 targets, it takes like 5 seconds approximately. So if the ads are not gonna live for like 20 seconds, which is application of Moonfires plus lunar eclipse, then don't do this. Otherwise, apply your Moonfires first, then enter lunar eclipse, and then Starfire. Starfire is incredibly important in lunar eclipse. You want to make sure you're Starfiring as much as you can on AoE when you're in lunar eclipse. So if you can refresh your Starfall before you enter, do that. Yeah, if your Starfall is in like a pandemic range, say it's like 3 seconds left, and you have enough Astral Power, you're about to enter lunar eclipse, Starfall before you enter, so you can enter lunar eclipse and then use your Balance of All Things window, your crit window, to Starfire the ads. It's gonna be a huge amount of damage. Starfire is really, really huge when it comes to AoE packs, right? Now, if there's 6 ads or more, you would rather overcap Astral Power than cast Starsurge. Because the Starfire casts are more valuable, it does more damage than the Starsurge does, plus the empowerment damage that you would get from the Starsurge. 6 or more, okay? If there's 6 or more ads, then definitely just continue to start to cast Starfire instead of Starsurging. Of course, you still want to Starfall, but don't Starsurge. Unless there's like higher HP targets, right? Like, let's say there's 7 mobs, 2 of the mobs have like more HP, and the other 5 have like lower HP. Then for your overall damage, it would be better to Starfire instead of Starsurging, even if you're overcapping in that scenario. But for actual dungeon speed, it would be better to Starsurge the high HP targets, right? You're gonna be losing a little bit of overall damage. It's not gonna be like a big deal, but you're doing more damage to those 2 targets, right? Because they need to die, otherwise the pull doesn't end. Just because the smaller ads die faster doesn't mean that the pull is gonna be done faster, because you need to kill all of the ads, right? So for dungeon speed, definitely make sure that if there's higher HP ads, Starsurge them instead of overcapping, right? And definitely also remember, again, think about the future. If you Starsurge, will you still have enough Astral Power to Starfall 100% of the time? If not, don't Starsurge. Okay, so after you do your opener, if the pull still takes a long time, then we're switching to the mid-pull priority list, okay? So these were just the openers. Once you're in the middle of a pull, your priorities change a little bit again. Let me talk about the priorities mid-pull. So keep Starfall up at all times, all costs. Keep Standfire up at all times, and only use 1 global to apply it, if you can, of course. And cycle between eclipses as fast as you can. When it comes to Moonfiring, if there are 4 or less ads, and they will survive until next eclipse, then you refresh your Moonfire in Solar or in Lunar Eclipse. It's worth it to do it in both. If they're between 4 and 10 ads, and they will survive until your next eclipse, then only refresh Moonfires in Solar Eclipse. The reasoning behind this is you don't want to refresh your dots outside of Eclipse, because then you're just spending more time outside, meaning you have less uptime on your Eclipse, less uptime on both, less uptime on nature damage increase / arcane damage increase, and so on, right? And the other reason is that Starfire is more valuable than Wrath. So you would rather spend the globals in the Solar Eclipse than you do in Lunar Eclipse. So therefore, try to always refresh your Moonfires in Solar if you're mid-pull. Don't refresh your Moonfires outside of Eclipse, and don't refresh your Moonfires in Lunar Eclipse unless it's 4 targets or less. Then you can also refresh them in Lunar, but it's still preferable in Solar. It's also worth it to do it in Lunar when there's 4 or less, but of course it's still preferable in Solar if you can choose which Eclipse you use to refresh your dots in. Then, when it comes to just general things, Lunar Eclipse, of course, is better than Solar Eclipse on AoE, so definitely try to maximize your Lunar Eclipse uptime. For example, when you can choose between Solar or Lunar after your cooldowns, or if you have been out of combat for a really long time, then make sure you enter Lunar first. And yeah, I actually think that was like all that I have right now for you guys. I want to talk a little bit about utility as well, but I figured utility is really something that is dependent on your group when it's being called. You know, sometimes people use Solar Beam, for example, only as a backup. So you should never like reactively Solar Beam when you think it's needed, because the Solar Beam is like a backup interrupt that should be used only when it's needed. But that is totally dependent on your group and what exactly you're doing. When you're pugging, it's of course a different kind of story, especially if you're not on voice chat. Then you should try to maximize the utility usage as much as you possibly can. I can recommend, when it comes to trees, for example, to add your tank's cooldowns onto your raid frames so you can see when they have something up. For example, I see when the DK is like, when the Demon Hunter is like meta up or Demon Spikes or whatever, and whenever that drops, I put my trees down. Or I also see the necrotic stacks on the tank. If he has high necrotic stacks, I put the trees down, he can reset. Or I see the incarnation of a Guardian Druid. When Incarn is up, he does not need trees, so he can delay it for after, and so on. I also recommend displaying the healer mana somewhere. I personally have a percentage mana indicator for the healer, so if I can see the healer's lower percent mana, I will just innervate the healer randomly if I'm not on voice chat. The best way to innervate a healer is actually by using it on Pride, because after the Pride is dead, you get the Pride buff, which also gives you mana regen. So for the 1 minute, your healer is going to be full mana at all times and not needing innervate, right? So I prefer just giving the innervate during Pride, when the healer is like at the end, when the mob is on like 20 stacks. Depends on your key level, of course. If you don't get up to 20 stacks, then you can use it before, of course. But yeah, stuff like that, definitely make sure you're min-maxing your utility. Make sure you see the enrage effect on your nameplate so you can soothe. Make sure you see curses and poison on your raid frame so you can help dispelling. Make sure you bind it properly. Bind your hibernate to make sure you can CC beasts, other mobs that you can use the hibernate on. I forgot what they're called. Anyway, then also make sure you... Cyclone is like a very niche utility that can be used though for certain things, like for example, to not refresh bursting. If there's bursting and you see we have like 7 stacks and it's about to refresh, cyclone the low HP mob so it doesn't die. If there's like dots on it, you know, it will not die and then it won't refresh the bursting. Also bolstering, if there's like a pull that you do and one mob is like much lower than all the other mobs and it's about to bolster everything, you can just cyclone the mob so it doesn't die. That kind of stuff you can do. Entangling Roots, a really good thing for multiple dungeons. Also like Mass Root, for example, you can go Mass Root for Plaguefall, really good there. You can use Mass Root for Spiteful Shades whenever the affix is up. And you can use... One more thing that is actually really nice is the fact that when you convoke, rooted targets or any breakable CC'd targets don't get hit by convoke and also don't get hit by Starfall, right? So if you're pulling a boss and you have like one extra at that somehow got pulled too, or maybe it's a Spiteful Shade that is also there from the previous pack, then what you can do is you can root that Spiteful Shade or that mob and then you convoke. Because your convoke then will go solely on the boss and then not per the target instead of hitting that random at there. So that's like a neat trick you can use to not have your convoke damage going to waste. You can also like cyclone it, or you can hibernate if you can use it, or you can ask other people to use their breakable CC so you can convoke. And yeah, that's all of the tips and tricks that I have right now. If you have any more questions and anything else that you want to know, you can definitely ask in the description below. I have also uploaded a bunch of commentary guides where I'm basically talking over my own gameplay, and I'm explaining why I'm doing this at what point. And those kind of videos might be containing some more information that you maybe missed today or that I didn't cover. So make sure you check that out as well if this guide was not enough information for you, or if you feel like you need some more tips. Either way, you can always ask me in my stream over at twitch.tv/Naguura. You're welcome to ask any questions there. I really hope this helped you out. Thank you so much for watching, guys. And remember to subscribe to my channel and make sure you click the bell so you get notifications whenever I post a new video. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, guys. I appreciate you guys. Have an awesome day and have fun playing Moonkin. I hope you're topping those damage meters, and have a good one. Bye, guys.